In this section of the course, I'm going to be focusing on dreams and specifically on dreams of healing. And in our culture, in our secular culture at least, I would say the approach to dreams can be summed up in Scrooge's attitude in A Christmas Carol, where he's having these life-altering visions and he's saying things like, I think it's, an undigested food for my dinner. I've actually heard people say things like that. When they have a very dramatic dream, they'll say, it was indigestion. So this is a sort of a commonsensical approach, but I want to make it clear that this is an outlier in terms of the world's traditions. If we look across the world's traditions, dreams are considered to be very important. We've already seen with shamanic traditions, dream counseling is a very important part of it. In indigenous traditions, dreams are taken very seriously. In some nations, they're central to spiritual practice. And even within North American subcultures, I know in Irish culture, often they're taken very seriously. But within the mainstream discourse, they're generally dismissed. So I want to start to look at some of the approaches that we find across the world's traditions. As with depictions of healing, I find that depictions of dreams in the Bible are often ignored, both in the Hebrew and New Testament, and they're very rarely spoken about. So if we look at Genesis, we find one of the most famous stories, obviously, of Joseph, and he has been put into prison, but he's brought out of prison by the Pharaoh because the Pharaoh has had a dream that he feels is important. So in Genesis 41:14, the Pharaoh said, I have heard it said that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. Joseph answered, it is not I. God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. So this really is the model for dream analysis pretty much across the board. It's when we get to Jung, we're going to see it's a very similar concept that you tell the person your dream and then they help you to interpret it. But I think what's important here too is that Joseph is saying it's the answer is not coming from him, it's coming from God. So the dream is very akin to vision in that sense that it's coming from God. So this is probably one of the most famous dreams of all time. Then the Pharaoh said to Joseph, in my dream I was standing on the banks of the Nile, and 7 cows, fat and sleek, came up out of the Nile and fed in the reed grass. Then 7 other cows came up after them, poor, very ugly and thin. Never had I seen such ugly ones in all the land of Egypt. The thin and ugly cows ate up the first 7 fat cows, and when they had eaten them, no one would have known that they had done so. So many of you will know that Joseph goes on to interpret. This is indicating there are going to be years of famine. And so it's a prophetic dream, and the Pharaoh is able to store up grain to get his country through, his nation through this series of famines that come. And as a result, Joseph is put into a position of great power within Egypt. So this is obviously a very famous dream, and it's often treated as a kind of a one-off, but the fact is, and when I get to Muslim dream analysis, this is an ongoing approach to dreams in what we would call the Middle East now, and it exists to this day. So there's nothing unusual about this. Dream interpreters would have been very common in that society at the time of when Genesis was written, but also into the present. So I just wanted to say, even for people that dismiss dreams, almost everyone I know anyway has had a dream that woke them in the night that they felt must mean something. I actually met a young woman years ago who had such a dramatic dream that she went in search of a dream interpreter, and she ended up going to dream conferences and things like that, because the dream, she was about to get married and the voice in the dream said, not him, not now. And so understandably, she was very perplexed by this dream and what it might mean. So I think that even in the most skeptical circles, many people have had either a disturbing dream or a dramatic dream that feels important in some way. So in the case of the Pharaoh, and this is very common also across culture, the idea that when somebody's in a position of power, they'll often dream for their whole society. Dr. Amira Mittermeier is a professor at the University of Toronto. She's an anthropologist, and she did her fieldwork in Egypt on systems of dream analysis. And I was very struck by her book that she took up a topic that is certainly within many circles controversial, and she did her thesis on it. That was already a very brave thing to do at the time. And she also started her book with one of her own dreams, and I just thought I was really really impressed by that she was putting her money where her mouth is in that sense. And the book went on to be very, very successful. But at that time, there was still that prevailing notion, particularly many times people in the social sciences and humanities feel they have to measure themselves by science. And so to talk seriously about dreams literally can be putting your career on the line. And I think it's perhaps speaking to the fact that things are changing, that her book was greeted with a lot of praise. Mittermeier talks about Egyptian culture and the ways in which dreams are such an important part of society. There's television programs where you can phone in and they'll interpret your dreams, and there's dream dictionaries for sale everywhere. Now that's true here too. I think it's just very underground. I think many people have dream dictionaries and perhaps work with their dreams privately, but in Egypt it's an open practice, and there are dream interpreters, often religious people, Sufis, who work as dream interpreters within that culture. So that's a continuous practice right from biblical times. And so she opens the book with this dream of hers. So she has this right at the beginning of her research. An open space, it might be desert. Men and women, maybe 15 in total, dressed in strange khaki uniforms. I recognize them. They're Sheikh Kusi's followers. I watch as they take small metal tubes in their hands, raise them to their faces, and push them into their eyes, all the way in until the tubes disappear. Okay, so I just want to work a little bit with this to give you some idea of how this might be approached. And it's important to note that from this point of view, this is a spiritual practice. It's about engaging with your spiritual life more than it is about solving daily problems per se. So interesting, an open space, it might be the desert. Now, obviously she's in that kind of a climate when she's having the dream, but nonetheless, the desert within kind of Judeo-Christian Muslim imagination is a space of prophecy. We know Jesus spent 40 days in the desert. Muhammad also went into the desert and into the mountains. So we talked about this in the section on shamanism, this idea of dreamscapes or landscapes that the shaman would enter into and vision. So men and women, maybe 15. So this idea that they're in uniform. So uniform in any setting tells us that they belong together. They're part of a group. And she says, I recognize them as Sheikh Kusi's followers. So these sheikhs that Amira Mittermeier was interviewing act as dream interpreters, and so is part of their spiritual practice. And they also teach their followers to do the same thing. And so they play this really central role in the culture of Egypt. I watch as they take small metal tubes in their hands, raise them to their faces, and push them into their eyes all the way in until the tubes disappear. This is an example of the way we all know this from dreams. It'll often use what seems to be a grotesque image. So it becomes important to not get stuck in the grotesqueness of the image and look at what it's trying to say. So I'm just going to move on to the next slide. Their movements are gentle but determined. Only round, white, inward turned eyeballs remain in the place where their eyes used to be. So you could look at this as a way of saying that sort of inward looking. If we think about those yogic practices, that idea of not being extroverted but being introverted and looking inward. Next, the sheikh hands them batteries which they swallow. So in dreams, typically you're looking at symbols. It's not to say, oh, batteries, I have to go buy batteries. It's, what do batteries symbolize? They symbolize energy. So they're swallowing energy. So she says that's why they see, I think that's the secret. So the idea that this inward looking practice that they're perhaps being taught by the sheikh, and also the energy that they're receiving through the practices is why they can see into these and have spiritual insight. So I'm just giving you an example of how this might be interpreted within dream analysis. Within Western psychology, the person most associated with dreams would be Swiss psychologist C.G. Jung. And he was a disciple of Freud, and they split at a certain point, but both worked with dreams in very different ways. However, Freud was the one who said that dreams were the royal road to the unconscious, and Jung took this up and made it even more central within how he worked with his analyses. And it has turned out in later years that a lot of Jung's writing was kept private until very recently, and it turns out he was extremely visionary and religious, and that was being kept kind of on the back burner because at that time he was presenting himself to the scientific community and attempting to use the language of science, but we now know he's much more akin to a mystic than a scientist in his approach. And so the way Jung works with dreams would be very familiar across the religious traditions of the world. In The Psychology of Dreams, written in 1916, Jung writes, "Dreams then convey to us in figurative language, that is, in sensuous, concrete imagery, thoughts, judgments, views, directives, tendencies, which were unconscious either because of repression or mere lack of realization." So he's talking about the idea, of course, he's written extensively on dreams. This is just one tiny fragment, but the idea that dreams use symbolic figurative language, and that's why people often dismiss them as nonsense, because they don't follow logically, and so they use imagery. And so it's very typical with Jungians to suggest that when the person's going through analysis, they buy a symbol dictionary so that they can look up the symbols and also work with what they mean to them personally. So we also see here the idea that the dream is gives us insight into our unconscious. And so Jungians have a different model of the mind, and I've talked in this course when we were looking at Buddhism, that idea that there is no one model of the psyche or the mind. And so within Western thought, that is also true. So the Jungians have a very different view of the mind, and they posit the idea of the unconscious mind, so things that are developing that we are unaware of. Now, when you read into Jung further, you find that there is an acceptance that these dreams have a prophetic element in them sometimes. And so he has a much more open approach than Freud, for instance. So typically when you do a Jungian analysis, you do it by bringing in your dreams, and then you work with your analyst to work through the dreams. And from a Jungian point of view, they'll often say that just before going into analysis, you'll get what's called a presenting dream or a big dream. And so Jungians note that there's different kinds of dreams. Some are more day-to-day, looking at day-to-day issues. Others are more symbolic, and others are big dreams. And so they can prefigure a whole period of time in your life. So for Jungians, dreams are at the center of how they practice psychology.